The night the 5 of them were born, the hospital lights hummed like a low prayer. She held them one after another, tiny, furious, impossibly perfect, and counted fingers and toes until her own hands shook. Outside the window the city slept. Inside everything changed forever. He promised the moon, and the months between his promises were like thin paper. He said he would make a place for them, that he would call, that he would come back when things settled. She believed him because hope is a kind of muscle. It keeps you moving when everything else wants to collapse. On the 3rd morning he left. He kissed her forehead like a benediction, whispered that he needed to go straighten things out, and walked out into a rain that never stopped in the telling. She named them as if naming would tether them to the earth. Maya, Elijah, Tasha, Malik, Isaiah. Neighbors brought casseroles for a week, and then the casseroles stopped. Friends drifted away like leaves. There were nights when the babies cried in different keys and she felt like a circus performer with 5 acts and no applause. She worked double shifts, learned to change diapers in the dark, learned to make 5 lunches in the same breath. She learned how far a single dollar could be stretched before it snapped. People in town told stories about him as if he were a villain in a cheap movie. Left her with 5 black babies, they said, as if that were the whole script. Children at school whispered and sometimes threw a word like a stone. The mother endured it all and kept walking, each step an insistence that these little lives would not be defined by the way he had left. The quintuplets grew not as a spectacle but as themselves. Maya could make a mean stack of pancakes and had the laugh that untied the tightest of grown-up knots. Elijah read physics the way other people breathe. He would take apart a radio to find where hope lived inside it. Tasha painted sunrise on any piece of paper she could steal. Malik had hands like a mechanic and eyes like he had read too many books about bravery. Isaiah sang in the church choir and made even the stern pastor smile. They shared secrets in the dark and stitched a family out of the thin cloth life gave them. There were moments when the absence of his name was a physical ache. Holidays, graduations, hospital rooms, lost jobs, the little deaths you bury and keep visiting. She would stand at the kitchen window sometimes and whisper his name into the night, more as a ritual than a request. No answer came, only the clock keeping time like a judge. Then, 30 years later, something happened that made half the town look twice. A streaming show did a human interest segment about families who beat the odds. The camera crew arrived with polite shoes and brighter lights than this family was used to. The 5 grown children, now 30, each carved by work and laughter and small catastrophes, sat side by side on a couch that had seen better days. The interviewer asked about childhood, about the nights the roof leaked, and about the dignity of choosing to laugh anyway. The piece wound through their successes and their bruises. It showed diplomas that looked older than the mortarboard kids who usually wore them. It showed a mechanic's hands, a painter's stained fingertips, a choir singing in harmony. It showed a mother whose hair had gone silver at the temples, whose laugh had become a badge of survival. After the segment aired, something even stranger happened. A man began to show up at the small coffee shop across the street. He wore expensive coats and an old, cautious smile. He sat alone and ordered black coffee, watching as if he had a map only he could read. He watched the mother from across the glass, and then, later, he watched the 5 of them, not too close, not too far. People noticed. Rumors bloom where silence waits. Someone on a message board recognized his face from a photograph that sat on a faded page of the town's archives. The same man, younger, in a picture with a ribbon cutting at a plant that had once promised jobs and then closed. He introduced himself at last, with the careful politeness of someone rehearsed. "I was hoping," he said, not quite meeting her eyes, "that I might buy you a coffee." The mother blinked as if the present and the past had collided into one impossible second. He said his name. The town held its breath. He said he had left because he had been a coward. He said he had been young and terrified, accused of things he did not have the strength to fight and afraid that staying would pull them into a chaos he could not control. He said he had watched from the margins because leaving seemed safer. He said he had been wrong. They listened. They listened to a man who had spent 3 decades building a life that would not touch theirs, and to a truth that he had, incredibly, been paying the bills in secret. The bank statements he produced were anonymous donations and small checks deposited into an account that had covered schooling, housing repairs, tuition, and the hospital bills they could not have paid. He had wired money for a piano for Isaiah once, and for an art scholarship for Tasha, and for an engine replacement for Malik's first car. He had done this under a string of names: an uncle, a donor, a neighbor who could not be found, always a small, careful intervention that never wanted to be seen. The town was scandalized and bewildered at once. "But he left her," people said, as if the question resolved only at the door. Some felt vindicated. They had believed the story and the old story needed its teeth. Others felt the sudden, uncomfortable heat of something more complicated. To have been abandoned does not erase the hands that found a hidden way to give. The quintuplets felt a tidal surge of many things: anger, gratitude, confusion, and a strange, tender curiosity. They remembered the nights when a check had arrived and kept their landlord at bay. They remembered the letter that had come with no return address and a forward line that read, "Keep going." They had spent years imagining the sender as many things: saint, phantom, threat. Never imagining him as the man sitting in the coffee shop with a voice like someone who had practiced sorrow. "How could you?" they demanded, not together but in a chorus of halting sentences. "Why not tell us? Why hide?" The man's face, when he heard them, looked a little younger and a little less sure. He said he had been trying to atone in a way he thought would not hurt them more. He described threats from a family that would have fought to take them, lawyers who might have used them as leverage, a pride he had swallowed that tasted like iron. He had not expected forgiveness. He had not expected even discussion. He had expected, maybe, the cold reception of a door slammed. Instead, he found a conversation that tore open years and let the wind in. They asked him about his life in the blank spaces where stories had been lost. He told them he had started 3 companies and failed at 2. He told them he had watched them from the margins because email and addresses and anonymity had been easy roads for a man wanting to make right without making noise. When the town learned, the reactions were not uniform. Some neighbors went to his defense, saying that the truth was messy and that the man had tried to fix what he had broken. Others refused to be reconciled. They had memories with edges, and those edges do not soften with explanation. The mother, who had stitched the days together with habit and will, folded her arms and asked for time. The quintuplets did something the town had not expected. They invited him to sit with them in the living room where paint peeled and family photos leaned like soldiers. They put out 5 plates and a pot of stew. They asked him questions they had invented in the night for years. "Did you think of us? Did you ever stop?" He had to tell them, finally, that he had thought of them like a pulse you can't stop, that leaving had hollowed him, that every birthday candle he blew out he imagined was theirs. A truth sometimes detonates old assumptions. The most shocking part for many was not that he had left, nor that he had returned. It was discovering that love can be messy and still real, that abandonment and silent generosity can be twined like 2 ropes. It was the image of a man who had failed in a public way but had tried, in a private one, to honor the consequences of his own actions. It was the bitter discovery that the story a town tells itself to sleep at night. The simple villain, the simple hero, rarely maps the cluttered geography of real lives. Forgiveness did not come clean and bright. It dripped and coagulated and returned in small, careful gestures. There were mornings when one of them would pick up the phone and call his number and hang up before he could answer. There were afternoons when he left envelopes with old family photographs and a note that read, "For when you're ready." There were nights when the mother sat on her porch with him and told stories she had kept for herself, naming things she had not yet named, letting him be a flawed witness to the life he had missed. In the end, the truth was simple and complicated. He had left, but he had also stayed, in the ledger of bills paid, in an anonymous check, in a scholarship application filed under a false name. He had been both absent and present, both coward and steward. The town gossiped and then grew quieter, as towns do when they watch a family rearrange the pieces of itself. The quintuplets learned to live with a new facet of who they were. They kept the anger they needed like a warm jacket and took the help they wanted like a lifeline. On a warm afternoon, they held a small party in the yard. There was music: Isaiah at the piano, Tasha painting faces on paper plates, Malik fixing a barbecue that had been stubborn all week, and the mother watched them move and felt something heavy and golden unclip inside her chest. The man who had left sat at the back, a careful guest, his hands folded so he would not break anything. He did not demand absolution. He did the small, steady things people do when they try to be present. He showed up at graduations, he met the children's friends, he listened when it was his turn to be criticized. Time, which had once been an enemy, became the only honest medium for reconciliation. Years later, the story of how he left and what followed would be told and retold. Some would tell it as a cautionary tale, others as a miracle. The truth, the family knew, would not fit neatly into any single telling. It was stitched from good intentions and terrible mistakes, from absent promises and quiet payments, from love that fled and love that lingered. It was messy. It was theirs. And on certain nights, when the house was quiet and the children had grown into people who made their own mistakes and their own matches, they would sit together and laugh until their ribs hurt. The mother would look at them and see all the small economies of survival laid out: the sacrifices, the anonymous checks, the stew, the late-night study sessions, The scraped knees healed with kisses. She would look at him, whose hair had gone white and whose hands had been steady perhaps too late, and she would whisper into the gathering dark, "We made it."